So what if I told you guys that the United States was nearly ripped apart 10 years before the Civil War? Would that surprise you? Because most people, the majority of people, don't know anything or know very little about the dispute that I'm about to talk about that occurred in 1850. And this, because of the Civil War, a lot of times this area of history is passed over, especially in history classes. And that's why I'm talking about it today. And this is the Compromise of 1850. And it's the epitome and the perfect example of what can happen when two opposing sides come together and compromise on things that are very important to everyone involved. And so we're going to examine kind of the disputes, what happened involving this, those key players in it, the key people that helped save the nation, and how it's still relevant and why it's important to us today. So, the Compromise of 1850 was a dispute that the United States was having in regards to the Mexican-American War that ended 2 years prior in 1848, along with the land and the territories that were acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. And so a lot of the western United States was vast territory, and it was up in the air of what they were going to do with it. And so naturally, the South believed that a lot of the new territories and states should be entered into the Union as slave states. So naturally, the North pushed back against that and said they're going to be entered in as free states, and that's going to be that. And there were other issues. The main areas in question were California. What were they going to do with the California territory, along with the Utah and New Mexico territories, whether they were going to be slave states or not. And there was a big border dispute between New Mexico and Texas on whose land was whose, and the runaway slaves. They were a huge issue for the South, and there wasn't much enforcement through the law dealing with them. And so the Southerners really wanted a for sure law that was set in place and enforced strongly, so that way they could have their property and it could be dealt with appropriately. So, and if they didn't get their way, the South threatened to secede, and that was where a big conflict came in. And Congress wasn't doing much because it was either going to be all one way or all the other, and they were butting heads. So, along comes the great compromiser, as he would be nicknamed after this dispute. His name was Henry Clay. He was a statesman from Kentucky. He was a member of the Whig Party, which would eventually merge and become the Republican Party as we know it. But Henry Clay was very active in politics. He was a politician and involved in public service nearly his whole adult life, from 1810 to 1852 when he passed away. Give or take a few years in between some elections, but for almost that whole amount of time he was involved in the government and politics. And Henry Clay was 3 times Speaker of the House, so he was very, very comfortable with mediating different conflicts that would arise, as he did in the House very often. He was also Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams from 1825 to 1829. So Henry Clay comes before Congress with this compromise that he said is going to save the Union. Two sides were butting heads, and no one was really willing to give up what they wanted. And Henry Clay proposed that each side give up something they want in return for something that they want. They were able to receive something they want as long as they give something to the other side. And so, this compromise that he came forth to Congress with was eventually split into 5 different bills. And the first bill resolution was that California would be admitted into the Union as a free state. And there wasn't any question about it, it would be free. And number 2 was that Utah and New Mexico would be entered into the Union, but they would have the option through popular sovereignty whether or not they wanted to be slave states. So they had the option to choose through the people. And the third one was the border dispute between New Mexico and Texas, and it favored New Mexico, giving New Mexico more land, and in return Texas got $10 million in order to pay off their debts that they had. And a fourth bill, was the slave trade in Washington, D.C. That was abolished, so there was no more slave trading within Washington, D.C. Slavery was still legal, but slave trade was not. And the fifth one was the Fugitive Slave Act, what the Southerners really wanted and what they were really after. And this law was reinforced and revamped in such a way that government officials were now obligated to find, report, and return runaway slaves to their owners in the South. And if they did not do so, their jobs were on the line and they would be fined. So there was a huge reason why they wanted to obey that, and the Southerners were very happy with that one as well. So eventually, with Congress, because this compromise was split into 5 different bills, each one was able to be passed, and it was a success. And Henry Clay was successful in distributing this compromise to Congress, and they were all able to pass each law, each bill, and agree on it. And the South was able to remain intact to the Union, and the United States was preserved for a time, for 10 years, as we come to know it, because the Civil War began 10 years later. And so, the real importance of why the Compromise of 1850 is so important, and why these 10 years, the 10-year gap between it, was so crucial, was that the North was able to revamp their economy, and they were able to industrialize themselves. And that means railroads, factories, and they were able to maintain a standing army and keep a standing army once they had built one. Whereas in 1850, the North didn't have those, the means to do that. They hardly had any factories, they hardly had the railroad system that was working efficiently. But this 10-year gap allowed them time to prepare for something such as a possible civil war, which almost broke out in 1850. So, because Henry Clay was able to be a mediator and a compromiser in this issue, and he was able to have success in it, this allowed him and the North to be able to find the man as we know, Abraham Lincoln. That was another huge factor of why the 10-year gap was so important. Because in 1850, Abraham Lincoln wasn't ready to take the mantle as president, and people hardly knew who he was, as he was only involved in the Illinois legislature and not the United States as a whole. And we all know his role, his prominent and important role in American history, and his fight for liberty and freedom. And that is why, because the Compromise of 1850 is so important, it allowed the United States to be preserved for a time where it was ready and prepared to take on something such as secession and a civil war.